Hello, YASA folks, wherever you're tuning in from around the world. I am Dr. Alex Henderson. My research area generally is queer young adult fiction and its many intersections with genre and the exciting things you can do there. And today I would love to talk to you about asexuality in YA, specifically ace protagonists and what they've been up to for the past couple of years. Some backstory on this before I begin. Back in 2018, which feels like and is a long time ago, but I'll get to that in a moment, I was in the early stages of my PhD and diving down any research rabbit hole I could see to do with sort of queer fiction and genre. And what I ended up with was this paper that you see before you on the screen. Let's talk about love, Tash, Tolstoy, and the asexual coming of age story. In this, I looked at the sort of brief history of asexuality in popular culture and the collection of cliches that it had gathered over its time in the spotlight, and a couple of YA novels, those two mentioned there in the title, that were evolving out of this trend but brought their own new nuances to the table and, of key interest to me, intersected with tropes of the coming-of-age story and the teen romance in a sort of refreshing and intriguing way while keeping those tropes largely intact. Now, 2018 was a long time ago, and this was published in 2019, which was still a long time ago, and a lot can change in that period. For example, in the past 5 years, I now have a doctorate and different pronouns, which are they, them, by the way. Um, and as you will see there, my topic, as it naturally does, narrowed down and found a niche more to do with non-binary representation and intersections with speculative fiction. But that all being done now, and up online, easy access and free to read. I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of return to the subject of that paper that I wrote many, many moons ago and sort of dip back into this field of asexual representation and see what's been going on there in the time that I've looked away. Queer YA, as people in the field will know, is a space that's really interesting because it is so constantly in flux and evolving and responding to each new generation of readers that it's targeted at. And publishing has been increasingly making more space for a variety of different voices in this field. And so let's go today. Let's come on a journey back into the world of ace protagonists and how their coming of age stories are constructed. Before we begin, though, of course, we got to give our definition of asexuality, and this is something I do kind of want to update and play with a bit from the version that I published back in 2019. And for this, I will borrow from Sharonda J. Brown from her book Refusing Compulsory Sexuality. Brown writes, people on the asexuality spectrum, also called ACE, experience little to no sexual attraction and or little to no sexual desire, and these things are not evidenced by either the presence or absence of sexual arousal or activity. Even though lacking sexual attraction and or desire is the widely accepted general definition, that's basically what I used back in 2018, I do not understand asexuality to be defined by this lack. It is not about being without sexuality, though some may choose to describe themselves in this way. I believe it is more true to say that asexuality is defined by a relationship to sex that is atypical to what has been decided on by society at large to be normative, and that atypical nature is marked by varying degrees of sexual attraction and desire. Asexual experiences stand outside what has been accepted and approved of as normal sexual experiences for both queer and the heterosexual communities. And I think that's a very useful working definition, both for my conceptualization of my own ace identity and, more importantly for our purposes today, how we're going to talk about the construction of fictional asexual characters. Now, this is not going to be a comprehensive study by any means. I simply do not have the time or the resources, but I'll do a quick little field overview of what I can see from a glance. The first exciting thing to note is that there's more of it. This has not, in fact, been a passing fad that we've all forgotten about 5 years later, and very heartening to see that publishing landscape is still making space for an increasing variety of asexual voices. And one exciting evolution in that space is the expansion into genre. Now, as I've written about elsewhere, particularly my paper about Melinda Lowe, who's also an excellent person to follow in terms of conversations about the development of queer YA itself and banned books and all that sort of things, but that's a tangent for another day. Genre fiction starring queer protagonist is really cool because it just expands upon the range of stories being told about queer characters and gives some readers in that space more options than just these sort of traditional expectations of the coming out, coming of age story. So here, for example, we have a really exciting range from the past few years. We have So Let Them Burn from this year, which is a high fantasy full of dragons and spirit magic, where one of the two point of view characters is demisexual. We have Aces Wild from 2022, which is a Vegas heist a la Ocean's 11. The Spider and Her Demons from last year, 2023, which is an urban fantasy adventure set in Sydney with a healthy heaping of body horror. And we have Don't Let the Forest In, which is coming out later this October, which promises to be a very mossy, yucky, dark academia horror extravaganza, for which I'm very excited. Now, of course, in queer YA, and it seems in ace fiction as well, specifically, the good old coming-of-age romance, drama, comedy combo is still the mainstay and still very much sort of the heart of the genre, and where you're going to find a lot of representation. And of course, where you're going to find that representation that more directly speaks to contemporary space and experiences of your contemporary teen readership. So here we have You Don't Have a Shot, which is a rivals to lovers soccer romance coming of age adventure. You have Planning Perfect, which is about an overachiever trying to plan her mother's wedding and navigating her relationships as someone on the asexual spectrum at the same time. And we have Dear Wendy from 2024 and Loveless from all the way back in 2020 as well. And I love these two together as they kind of form an interesting bracket of this kind of era, if you will, of ace fiction. They're also an important point to bring up here because they have asexual and aromantic protagonists, which is a good opportunity to take a time to point out that those are not the same thing. They are often conflated and often presumed to go together. However, aromanticism and asexuality are two different beasts. Obviously, they have a lot of overlap, in little to no sexual attraction, little to no romantic attraction. The discourses overlap quite a lot. The Venn diagram overlaps quite a lot. But aromantic protagonists is I don't want to mention it here, but it is a different space that I would absolutely love other scholars who are not me and who can speak to their own aromantic perspective to dive into more deeply. I think there's especially some interesting stuff to talk about in how Loveless and Dear Wendy, which are both these sort of college coming of age, they sort of almost take the rom-com formula but remix it from an aromantic point of view. An a rom-com, perhaps. I would love to see somebody dig into that. So if somebody already has, please drop me the link. And if somebody hasn't yet, I'm very excited to see this field of scholarship and this field of fiction continue to evolve. Now, for our case study today, I'm just going to do one rather than the two to mirror the original paper. I'm going to look at Ren Martin Ruins It All by Amanda DeWitt, which came out in 2023. This is not like the paragon and the platonic ideal of asexual fiction from this era by any means. I just think it's a fun book that I'd like to showcase, and it has some interesting stuff to bounce off in terms of the methodology and the points that I talked about in the original paper. And it would be interesting, I think, to see how some points I bring up are now echoed in this newer book. A basic rundown of the plot is our hero, Ren Martin, has just become student council president on a humorous technicality, and his first order of business is to try and ban the school's Valentine's Day dance. Part of his motivation is financial because it takes a lot of money away in his comically dilapidated school, but part of it is also personal because Ren is asexual and has always been deeply alienated by the dance, its deep emphasis on romance, and its beloved, highly praised place in the school's culture. Ren's rival and fellow council member Leo suggests getting a social app called Buddy to sponsor the dance, which gets rid of Ren's financial argument, and reluctantly, Ren has to go along with this. Also reluctantly, Ren tries using this social app and develops a friendship and perhaps something more with the person that he's talking to anonymously on there. He then ends up in a love triangle that actually only involves two people because spoilers, but of course, his anonymous digital crush is in fact his in-person rival, Leo. This is a pretty classic, American teen coming-of-age comedy, which opens with the protagonist running face first into a closed door while trying to get to a council meeting on time. It more or less keeps up that chaotic energy throughout the book with some threads of deeper character drama about grief and living up to expectations and other things along those lines. So this is already an example of an asexual protagonist finding their place in a very tried and true genre format, which in and of itself is really nice. And Ren being asexual does factor into the plot, but following a greater trend we have seen in queer YA over the years, him being ace isn't presented as being the problem in the book. The actual source of conflict, as I'll get to more in just a second, is society's expectations and the ways that he has to navigate them. And this follows a movement towards framing homophobia and heteronormative society as the problem and the source of conflict in YA, rather than the character's queerness itself, which was more likely the case way back in the early days. Interestingly, reflecting actually my books from 5 years ago, as well as sort of more recent trends, there's no internal angst or a plotline about Ren discovering or coming to terms with his asexuality, and he's already comfortable with that label by the start of the book. His issues lie with the possible reception of this by society. A couple of other quick things I want to point out. Ren is a still relatively rare example of a male asexual protagonist. There is a point in the novel where he has to select a gender marker in the app he's using and says, quote, "Gender is complicated, but male is close enough." So there may be other underlying gender identity stuff going on here, but they never fully bubble to the surface, so for the purpose of this, let's follow from Ren's lead and count him as one of the few ace boys in a field that's still mostly occupied by female leads, with a couple of non-binary protagonists in there as well. I also want to make note that he's a male protagonist with a male love interest. He's not the first one to have same-sex protagonist and love interest. There are quite a few books, if you go back a couple slides, you will see have that as well. So it's not like wholly new. In fact, even the books that I looked at in my original study, Let's Talk About Love, for example, had a biromantic and asexual protagonist. And so it's not like this is a new wave of books that are exploring intersections of asexuality and other kinds of queerness, but it does seem to be becoming more common, and that is really interesting and cool in and of itself. Now, let's talk about love, specifically Ren's political campaign against it. Much of his angst is targeted at the social construct of romance, which is interesting because Ren is not aromantic. He does make the distinction clear, narrating, quote, "I used to wonder if I was aromantic too, if it went hand in hand with asexuality like some kind of 2-for-1 deal. For some people it might." Later adding, quote, "I'm always tempted to think that it might be easier if I were, but I cringe internally at the thought. I know better than that. The world already thinks you're broken for not experiencing sexual attraction. It's practically designed around the idea of the romantic relationship. No, I don't think that's very easy at all." So here Ren ponders, but then rejects the idea that asexuality and aromanticism always go together, but he does express solidarity for his aro brethren, even as he explains that he doesn't identify that way. I think it's a really interesting and useful way to make that distinction. Now, in this passage, Ren does highlight the heart of his problem, that the world is practically designed around the romantic relationship. And as far as Ren is concerned, the expectations of sex are inextricably bound up in the expectations of romance, especially where the so-called universal spirits of being a teenager are concerned. And by proxy, Ren is alienated and cut out of these experiences because he's ace, as you can see in this quote here on the screen. Which is a short version of is, "I already know that dating while asexual is harrowing. It's exactly why I don't do it. It feels like an asterisk after my name or a warning label on the back of my head. If you want the full Hollywood experience, look elsewhere." This reflects the anxieties expressed by the two ace protagonists I previously studied. For example, Alice from Let's Talk About Love also considered the complications that come from the social expectations around sex and romance, and determined that, quote, "it seems easier to just not date, despite her strong sense of romantic attraction to her love interest." While I couldn't get my hands on this one in Australia, unfortunately, even just looking at the blurb of Hayley Neal's Planning Perfect, which we saw a couple slides ago, shows that this anxiety also underpins other ace YA narratives. It says, "There's just one potential hiccup. Felicity, who is the protagonist, knows that she falls somewhere on the asexuality grayscale, but she hasn't quite figured it out yet. She's consumed with gnawing worry about whether it's okay to explore things with this girl. She likes Nancy a lot, but she isn't sure she'd ever want them to get physical. What will happen if Nancy has a different idea of what it means to be more than friends?" The expectation that a sexual relationship must naturally follow from a romantic one positions asexuality as a hiccup in the dating progress. Wren's nod to the full Hollywood experience also reflects this trend of sort of meta-awareness in YA protagonists, particularly queer ones, about the pop cultural traditions that inform our expectations of love and how they don't fit into them. I wrote more about that in another conference presentation, which also talked about Loveless, which I will also link in the notes that I have attached. Now, so Ren, like the other protagonist I've looked at, also displays this canny awareness of the stereotypes and stigma surrounding asexuality, and he draws attention to them throughout the text in a way I think will be sort of relatable, where either funny or in bittersweet way, to readers who share his experience. For example, he points out the conflation of asexuality with immaturity, saying, quote, "People already think you're childish when you're asexual, or that you've not quite grown up yet, or are just naive." As in the section I quoted earlier, he also notes the tendency to mark asexual people as broken, and he engages with the stigma faced within the queer community too, which is another interesting layer of intersectionality that feels like a newer evolution. Again, not unique, but different perspectives and more perspectives on it are emerging. Ren says, "Some people don't think that asexual, aromantic people are queer, or just not queer enough, without another letter tacked on. And, well, it's a shitty feeling being told that you don't belong by people who are supposed to know what it's like to be treated like there's something wrong with you." Because this is a rom-com though, Ren does get the boy in the end, and interestingly, in a departure from my previous two case studies, the worry that this relationship won't work because of Ren's asexuality and because Leo is not asexual is a relatively minor part of the conflict. Ren has a brief conversation with Leo, although it's anonymously via the app, where he discloses his asexuality and his love interest completely takes it in stride, and the potential conflict here is resolved before it begins in a couple of sentences, as opposed to in Tash Tolstoy and Let's Talk About Love, where this tension formed quite a large part of the plot and the character's emotional arc. There could be a few reasons for this. It could be that DeWitt just didn't want to belabor this point and included a much more casual acceptance from the love interest to, once again, position asexuality not as a problem, and to instead devote more time to the other shenanigans making up the rom-com plot and keeping the love interests apart in ways that are uniquely stupid for those two characters. There's always going to be that tension between trying to make something realistic and trying to provide escapist alternate visions of what queer acceptance could and should look like. In this case, I was surprised but did really enjoy this, that while Ren clearly has to navigate society's larger expectations around romance that he has such a vendetta against, his asexuality is a non-issue in his romance plotline itself. Is this indicative of a change in how characters being ace is included in the romance conflict in new books that writers are writing? Maybe. I would have to look more deeply into more books to make that call officially, but it's a small but interesting change that points to a way forward. So here we come. As I said, here we come to the end. As I said, this was not a super comprehensive look, but it was a little dip back into this field, and it's been exciting to see the evolutions that have happened while I have been elsewhere in Genderland and Fantasyland. We've seen there's simply more books, which is so exciting because that improves and expands the range of stories that are available. We have expansions into genre, giving us a whole range of different stories to explore, to which asexuality may be very important, or may be an interesting side detail, while other crazy nonsense goes on, like slaying dragons and working out what's wrong with your friend who is making horrible monsters from his dreams come to life. All that fun stuff, all that fun teen stuff. There's also an increasing swing, as with YA generally, towards framing social expectations as the source of conflict rather than asexuality itself, and acknowledging the difficulties you might face while dating as an ace person, while also creating escapist rom-com scenarios where being ace doesn't affect the romantic arc itself. Consistent with my previous studies, Ren is deeply self-aware about the way asexuality is perceived, and speaks about this in a way that I feel will be relatable to young ace readers or 30-year-old ace readers with doctorates, for example, completely randomly. And while he has to navigate a normative world, his Being ace is not presented as a source of conflict in and of itself, and DeWitt refrains from weighing him or his coming-of-age story down with any internalized aphobia or self-loathing conflict, instead making space for more genre-typical shenanigans and providing a happy ending. And I think for that reason, Ren Martin is a really interesting example of where we are now and perhaps the way forward. Who knows? Maybe I'll come back again in another 5 years and look at the next wonderful pile of largely purple covered books that explore this area and bring it more and more into popular culture. For now, though, I will wrap up and I will look forward to seeing you all at the roundtable discussion at whenever it is appointed. I will see you there. All right. Cheers, everybody, and have a good rest of the virtual conference.